The old chapel at Ashwick Abbey had not held a proper congregation in years, and Eleanor Vane told herself that was precisely why she came there each night to pray, because a ruined place asked nothing of her, expected nothing of her, and could not, unlike every other corner of her narrowing world, be used against her. She did not know, that particular evening in early autumn, that she was not alone. She knelt before the broken altar rail, with her shawl drawn tight against the chill that lived permanently in stone walls, untouched by fire for a generation, and she whispered the same prayer she had whispered every night for a fortnight, not for wealth, not for rescue in any grand or dramatic sense, but simply for the courage to survive what was coming. In 11 days she was to marry Baron Halstead, a man 3 times her age with cold eyes and colder hands, a man her uncle had selected with the same careful calculation he applied to every ledger in his study, because Baron Halstead's fortune would clear the whole of Edmund Marsh's considerable debts in a single stroke, and Eleanor Vane's happiness had never once entered into her uncle's careful arithmetic. She did not hear the second set of knees settle against the cold stone floor some distance behind her, nor the quiet, indrawn breath of a man who had come to that same broken altar seeking his own private communion with grief, and found himself, instead, listening to a stranger's prayer with a stillness that felt, to him, almost like trespass upon something too private and too sacred for any uninvited witness. He had not meant to overhear her. He had come to the ruined chapel that night, as he had come nearly every night since his arrival at Ashwick, to kneel before the small side altar where his younger brother's memorial stone had been laid 3 months before, and to sit with a grief he could not yet bring himself to carry openly before the whole of the county. He had heard the chapel door creak open behind him, and had drawn back instinctively into the shadow of a broken pillar, unwilling to be discovered in a moment of such private mourning. And it was there, hidden in the dark, that he had heard her begin to pray, her voice low and unsteady, asking for nothing more than the strength to bear what she could not escape. He did not know her name. He knew only that something in the quiet dignity of her prayer, the absence of self-pity, the fierce, unadorned courage of a woman preparing to endure rather than beg to be spared, struck him with a force that made his own grief, for one unexpected moment, feel almost bearable by comparison, a lightening he had not thought himself capable of feeling again since the news of his brother's death had first reached him abroad. Eleanor rose at last, brushing the dust of the chapel floor from her skirts, and turned to leave, her thoughts already drifting back toward the quiet dread that awaited her at Marsh House, and it was only then, in the pale moonlight falling through the broken tracery of the east window, that she caught the shape of a man rising from the shadows behind her, and let out a small, startled cry that echoed off the ancient stone. "Forgive me," he said quickly, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of harmless surrender. "I did not mean to frighten you. I did not realize the chapel was occupied until you had already begun to pray, and I confess I did not know how to announce myself without disturbing something that seemed, even to a stranger, rather sacred." Eleanor pressed a hand to her racing heart, studying the man before her with wary caution. He was tall, dressed in a plain traveling coat that had seen better days, his dark hair unkempt in a manner that suggested a man who had not troubled himself with a valet's attention in some time, and there was something in his bearing, a kind of careful, contained sorrow that made her fear ebb more quickly than she expected. "You gave me a considerable fright, sir," she said, though her voice had steadied by the time she finished speaking. "I did not think anyone else troubled themselves with this old ruin. The roof leaks over the north transept, and the villagers say the place is unlucky, since the fire took the old rectory beside it." "I have never put much stock in luck," he said, "only in grief, which seems to me a far more reliable visitor to old chapels than luck ever was." Something in the plain honesty of his answer caught her off guard, and she found herself studying him with new interest, rather than lingering suspicion. "You have come here to grieve, then?" "I have," he admitted, and something in his voice suggested the confession cost him more than he let show. "My name is Cross, Alaric Cross. I am newly arrived at the Abbey, engaged to catalogue the old chapel records for the estate. A scholar's errand, nothing more. And you, if I may ask, without further alarming you with my sudden appearance from the shadows?" "Eleanor Vane," she offered, after only the briefest hesitation, some instinct telling her that whatever grief this stranger carried, it was not the sort that posed her any danger. "I live at Marsh House, some half-mile beyond the village. I come here most evenings. It is quieter than anywhere else I am permitted to be alone, and I find I have grown rather fond of its particular, patient silence." He did not ask why solitude mattered so much to a young woman of evident gentility, though something in her careful phrasing, "permitted to be alone," settled into him with the particular weight of a confession offered without the speaker fully realizing its significance. "Then I hope I have not spoiled your solitude tonight, Miss Vane." "You have not," she said, and found, to her own faint surprise, that she meant it entirely. She did not know, walking home through the cold autumn dark a short while later, that the man who called himself Cross was in fact Alaric Sinclair, 7th Duke of Ashwick, master of the very abbey whose ruined chapel she had claimed as her private sanctuary. Nor did she know that he had watched her retreating figure from the chapel door long after she had disappeared into the darkness, already turning over, with a dangerous and unfamiliar hope, the question of when he might contrive to find her there again. Alaric had returned to Ashwick only 3 weeks before, under circumstances he had shared with almost no one beyond his solicitor and the small household staff sworn to discretion. His younger brother, Henry, had died abroad the previous spring, in circumstances the family had agreed, by unspoken consent, never to discuss in detail. A duel, fought over a woman's honor, that had proven, in the aftermath, to have never truly been threatened at all. A foolish, avoidable death that had left Alaric the last of his line, and the whole weight of a dukedom he had never expected nor wanted, resting suddenly and entirely upon his shoulders. He had spent the summer in London enduring the careful, performative condolences of a society that seemed, to his grief-raw eyes, more interested in the vacancy his brother's death had created among the season's most eligible bachelors than in any genuine sorrow for a young man's wasted life. He had come to Ashwick seeking silence, and had found, instead, in the very first week of his return, that his aunt, Lady Prudence Sinclair, who had managed the estate's affairs during his long absence abroad, had already begun quietly arranging inquiries into potential brides, convinced that a duke burdened by grief required nothing so much as a suitable marriage to steady him. Alaric had resisted every introduction she attempted, weary of the particular calculation he saw in every eligible young woman's eyes, not affection, but arithmetic, the careful weighing of a title against the burden of a man clearly still drowning in mourning. It was this weariness, more than any scholarly interest in chapel records, that had first driven him to adopt the name of Cross and the guise of a visiting antiquarian, a small, private rebellion against a world that saw only his rank, never the man beneath it. He had not expected, in the ruined chapel where his brother's memorial stone lay quiet beneath the broken window, to find another soul seeking the same fragile solitude he sought. Nor had he expected that soul to belong to a woman whose prayer, overheard by accident, would lodge itself so immediately and so completely beneath his grief-worn heart. He returned to the chapel the following evening, and the evening after that, each time telling himself it was merely coincidence, each time finding Eleanor there before him, kneeling at the same broken altar rail, and each time discovering that the hour spent in her quiet company eased something in his chest that London's most sympathetic condolences had entirely failed to touch. Their conversations grew, evening by evening, from careful courtesy into something warmer, though Eleanor guarded her deeper confidences with the particular caution of a woman who had learned, through hard experience, that trust offered too freely could be turned into a weapon against her. She told him, in careful pieces, of her father's death some years before, a country curate whose small living had died with him, and of her mother's passing not long after, leaving Eleanor entirely dependent upon her uncle's grudging guardianship. She did not tell him, not at first, of Baron Halstead, nor of the 11 days, soon reduced to 10, then 9, then a handful, that stood between her and a marriage she dreaded more with every passing evening. It was Alaric who finally drew the truth from her, on a night when she arrived at the chapel with red-rimmed eyes she could not entirely disguise despite the darkness. "You have been weeping," he said quietly, settling beside her on the cold stone step, rather than at his customary distance. "I will not press you to confess the cause, if you would rather keep it private, but I confess, I find I cannot easily sit in comfortable silence while you carry so plain a sorrow beside me." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether to speak the truth she had carried alone for weeks. "I am to be married," she said finally, the words falling flat and heavy into the chapel's ancient silence. "In 9 days now, to Baron Halstead, a man I have met exactly twice, both times in the presence of my uncle, who has already spent the whole of Halstead's promised settlement, in his own mind, a dozen times over. I do not love him. I do not think I could learn to, whatever patience I brought to the effort. But my uncle's debts require the match, and I have no fortune of my own with which to refuse it, and no family beyond his roof willing to shelter me should I try." Alaric felt something cold and furious settle in his chest at the plain, resigned despair in her voice. Not despair born of weakness, he understood, but despair born of genuine helplessness, the particular grief of a woman clear-eyed enough to see every door closing around her, and proud enough not to beg for a rescue she did not believe existed. "Does he treat you unkindly, this Baron Halstead, in the little acquaintance you have had of him?" "He does not need to raise his voice to make his cruelty plain," Eleanor said. "He speaks to me the way a man speaks of a purchase already made, weighing its usefulness rather than its feelings. I do not think he will ever strike me, Mr. Cross, if that eases your evident concern, for he is not a man given to such open displays of feeling of any kind. I think he will simply forget, within a year, that I am capable of feeling anything at all worth considering." The quiet devastation of that answer settled into Alaric with a force that surprised him, and he found himself, in that moment, wanting nothing so much as to reveal the whole of his concealed rank and power on the spot, to simply announce that a duke's authority could unravel a baron's marriage settlement with a single well-placed word. But some careful instinct held him back, some fear that revealing his title now, in the raw aftermath of her confession, would transform whatever pure and unguarded thing had grown between them into something transactional, a rescue offered in exchange for gratitude rather than a love offered freely for its own sake. He wanted, with a desperation he did not fully understand, to be loved as Cross before he risked being valued as Ashwick. "Then let us not speak of Halstead tonight," he said instead, gently, his voice low enough that it seemed almost to belong to the chapel's own hush. "Let us speak instead of anything else in this world that might, for 1 hour, make you forget him entirely." She looked at him with something like gratitude, and something else beneath it that neither of them yet dared to name, and for that one stolen hour, beneath the broken tracery of the old chapel window, Eleanor Vane allowed herself the dangerous luxury of simply being happy. There were quieter moments, too, in those early weeks, that neither of them spoke of aloud, but both carried carefully afterward. There was the evening a sudden rain drove them both beneath the shelter of the chapel's remaining roof, and they sat in companionable silence, listening to the water drum against broken slate, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, neither one willing to break the fragile peace of it with unnecessary words. There was the afternoon, rare and stolen, when Eleanor mentioned in passing that she had once loved to sketch before her mother's death, made such idle pursuits impossible to justify, and Alaric had appeared at the chapel 2 evenings later with a small set of drawing pencils he claimed, unconvincingly, to have found forgotten among the estate's old records. "You are a poor liar, Mr. Cross," she told him, turning the pencils over in her hands with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and a tenderness she was not yet ready to name. "No one forgets drawing pencils among a set of parish ledgers." "I confess I have never been especially skilled at deception," he said, and something in the dry irony of his own words made him wince slightly, though Eleanor did not yet understand why. "Will you draw something for me, one evening, if I bring a proper sketchbook to replace the ledger margins you have surely been ruining?" "Perhaps," she said, and the small, private smile that followed felt, to both of them, like a significant concession. There was also the night, some 3 weeks into their acquaintance, when Eleanor arrived at the chapel later than usual, her composure visibly frayed, having spent the afternoon enduring Baron Halstead's second formal visit to Marsh House. Alaric had not yet learned the Baron's name at that point, only that some fresh unhappiness weighed upon her, and he had not pressed her to explain it, offering instead simply to sit beside her in silence until whatever storm moved through her had passed. It was that patience, the absence of demand, the willingness to simply remain, that Eleanor would later identify as the moment her guarded heart first began, however reluctantly, to trust him. "You do not ask me many questions I am not ready to answer," she observed that night, watching him in the moonlight, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful than it had been. "Most people press. You simply wait, as though patience itself were a kindness you had learned to offer deliberately, rather than a habit you simply fell into by chance. I have found," he said quietly, "that the truths people are not yet ready to share are usually the truths that matter most, and pressing for them too soon only teaches a person to guard them more carefully. I would rather wait for what you choose to give me, Eleanor, than demand what you are not yet ready to offer." She did not know, hearing those words, how precisely they described the very deception he himself was practicing upon her, nor how heavily that irony would weigh upon him in the weeks to come. There was one evening, some weeks before the Sunday revelation, when the careful distance both of them had maintained nearly gave way entirely. Eleanor had arrived at the chapel unusually late, her wedding to Halstead, then only a fortnight distant, and something in her quiet, controlled despair that night had undone Alaric's usual restraint. "I do not know how to face what is coming," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper in the chapel's vast, echoing dark. "I have tried to imagine a version of myself capable of enduring a lifetime beside a man I do not love, and I confess, Mr. Cross, that I cannot find her. I do not know where to look for the courage such a life will require." "You will not need to look far," he said, moving closer than he had ever permitted himself before, close enough that she could see the particular intensity in his eyes, even in the chapel's dim light. "I have watched you carry burdens these past weeks that would have broken a lesser spirit entirely, Eleanor, and you have carried them with a grace I find myself thinking of at every hour I am not beside you, in ways I have not yet found the courage to fully name aloud. Whatever courage this marriage demands of you, I promise you already possess it in greater measure than you credit yourself." "That is a kind thing to say," she said softly, "though I wonder sometimes whether kindness alone is sufficient reason for the way I have come to feel about you, Mr. Cross, when I know so little of your own history beyond the grief you carry so quietly. I know I ought not to speak so plainly. I know nothing can come of it, given all that stands between us. But I find, some nights, that I no longer know how to guard the feeling as carefully as I once did." He had wanted, in that moment, more than anything else in his careful, grief-shadowed life, to close the small distance between them entirely, to confess the whole of his concealed identity on the spot, to tell her that nothing at all needed to stand between them if only she would trust him with the truth, whatever the risk of that trust might cost them both in the eyes of a watching, judging world. But the fear of transforming her genuine affection into mere gratitude, of watching her tenderness curdle into calculation the instant she understood what his rescue might cost her in independence and pride, held him back once more, a fear he could not fully articulate even to himself, and he said instead, only, "Then do not guard it, if guarding it costs you more than it protects. Whatever comes, Eleanor, know that these evenings have meant more to me than you can yet understand." It was a near confession that satisfied neither of them entirely, and it was this same unspoken tension, still unresolved, that hung between them on the Sunday morning when the vicar's careless announcement finally forced the truth into the open. It was her uncle who first threatened to end their fragile understanding, however, weeks before that Sunday arrived, though he did not yet know precisely what he threatened. Edmund Marsh had grown suspicious of his niece's evening absences, and though he cared little for the particulars of how Eleanor occupied her solitary hours, he cared a great deal for the reputation upon which Baron Halstead's continued goodwill depended. He confronted her directly one evening before she could slip away to the chapel, his voice carrying the particular sharp impatience of a man whose own comfort depended entirely upon a transaction he did not intend to see jeopardized. "You have been seen walking toward the old chapel ruins these past weeks," he said, not looking up from the ledger he was studying, alone and after dark, which is unbecoming enough for any young woman, let alone one soon to be a baroness. "If word of this reaches Halstead before the wedding, Eleanor, I promise you the consequences will fall upon you far more heavily than they will ever fall upon me." "I go to pray, uncle," Eleanor said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "There is no impropriety in seeking quiet devotion." "There is considerable impropriety in a young woman wandering unescorted after dark, whatever pious excuse she offers for it," her uncle said. "I have heard, too, that a stranger has taken lodgings at the Abbey to catalogue its old records. A Mr. Cross, I believe. I trust your evening devotions have not made his acquaintance." Eleanor's silence answered the question more plainly than any words could have, and Edmund Marsh's expression darkened considerably. "You will end this foolishness at once. Whatever comfort you have found in a stranger's company, it cannot survive the arithmetic of my debts, nor the promise I have already made to Halstead's solicitor. 9 days remain, Eleanor. I would advise you to spend them preparing your heart for the marriage that will actually take place, rather than indulging fancies that can lead nowhere but disappointment." She did not answer him, though the warning settled into her with a cold, familiar dread, and she found herself, in the days that followed, torn between the fierce, unfamiliar hope that had bloomed in the chapel's quiet darkness and the bitter certainty that hope itself had never once, in her whole difficult life, proven trustworthy. She went to the chapel anyway, on the 11th night before her wedding, driven by a desperation she could not entirely name, though she did not yet know that within 2 days the whole careful architecture of secrecy she and Alaric had built between them would collapse in front of the entire parish. It happened on Sunday, at the main estate chapel, where the county's families gathered each week for services considerably grander than the ruined sanctuary Eleanor had claimed for her private devotions. She had not expected to see Alaric there at all. She had never once imagined Mr. Cross, a humble scholar of chapel records, attending services meant for the estate's principal family and their guests. And so her heart had nearly stopped when the vicar, midway through the opening prayers, paused to make a small formal announcement to the assembled congregation. "Before we continue," the vicar said, "I believe many of you will be glad to know that His Grace, the Duke of Ashwick, has returned at last to worship among us, following his long absence abroad. We are grateful, Your Grace, for your presence this morning, and for your generous continued support of the parish." Eleanor's head turned, along with every other head in the chapel, toward the family pew at the front of the nave, and there, dressed now in a coat of fine, dark superfine, entirely unlike the plain traveling clothes she had always known him to wear, sat the man she had called Cross for nearly a month, his expression carefully composed into the practiced neutrality of a man long accustomed to public scrutiny, though she saw, even from across the crowded chapel, the precise instant his eyes found hers and widened with unmistakable alarm. She did not remain for the whole of the service. She rose quietly during the second hymn, murmured some excuse about a sudden faintness to the elderly woman seated beside her, and fled the chapel with her heart hammering so violently she could scarcely draw breath, every gentle, unguarded confession she had offered him over the preceding weeks rearranging itself, in that single devastating moment, into something that felt suddenly, sickeningly, like a trap she had walked into with her eyes wide open. He watched her go, and understood, with a sinking certainty, exactly what her flight meant. She went to the chapel anyway, on the 9th night before her wedding, driven by a desperation she could not entirely name, and found Alaric already waiting for her among the shadows, his expression grave, in a way that told her, before he spoke a single word, that something significant had shifted. "I must explain myself," he said, "though I understand explanation may do little to ease what you already know." Eleanor's composure, held together by sheer will since she had fled the chapel that morning, finally cracked. "I do not require explanation of the fact itself, Your Grace." The vicar announced it, plainly enough for the whole parish to hear. "What I require, if you owe me anything at all after these past weeks, is an explanation of why you let me speak to you as though we occupied the same small, ordinary world, when all along you possessed the very power that could have ended my engagement to Halstead with a single word, had you chosen to use it, and you said nothing." "I did not withhold the truth to harm you," he said, though he heard, even as he spoke, how hollow the defense sounded against the plain fact of the deception itself. "I withheld it because I have spent my whole adult life watching people's regard for me transform the instant they learn my title, and I could not bear the thought of watching the same transformation happen in your eyes. I wanted, for once in my life, to be loved as merely a man, before I risked being valued only as a duke. And I told myself, each evening I let the deception continue, that I would find the courage to confess it the very next time we met, though I never once did, until the choice was taken from me entirely by a vicar's careless announcement." "And in the meantime," Eleanor said, her voice rising now with a hurt she could no longer contain, "you let me confess the whole of my helplessness to you, my uncle's debts, Halstead's cruelty, my own fear of a marriage I cannot escape, while you alone understood, the entire time, that you possessed the power to end it. Do you understand what that means, Your Grace? I trusted you with my most private despair, believing myself speaking to someone as powerless as I am, when in truth you held my very fate in your hands and chose, for weeks, to say nothing." He had no answer that could soften the justice of her accusation, and he did not attempt one. "You are right to be angry," he said. "I have taken something from you that I had no right to take, the choice of knowing precisely who held power over your circumstances and choosing for yourself how much of your heart to risk accordingly. I can only tell you that everything else between us was real. Every hour I spent beside you in this chapel, every word of comfort I offered, was offered by the same man, whatever name he wore. The title changes nothing about what I feel for you, Eleanor. It only changes what I am now finally able to do about it." "And what is that, Your Grace?" Her voice was bitter now, though beneath the bitterness ran a thread of desperate, unwilling hope she could not entirely suppress. "Will you simply purchase my freedom from Halstead, as though I were a debt to be settled, rather than a woman whose trust you have already spent so carelessly?" "I will do whatever proves necessary to see you safe from a marriage that would only bring you misery," he said. "But I will not pretend that action alone can undo the wound I have caused by concealing myself from you these past weeks. I do not ask you to forgive me tonight, Eleanor. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, through action rather than further words, that what grew between us in this chapel was never a duke's idle amusement, but the truest thing I have felt since my brother's death." She did not answer him. She turned and walked from the chapel without another word, leaving Alaric alone beneath the broken window with the cold, hollow certainty that he had, through his own careful cowardice, very nearly destroyed the one genuine thing to have entered his grief-shadowed life in over a year. Eleanor did not return to the chapel the following evening, nor the evening after, though she found herself, in the sleepless hours before dawn, replaying every conversation they had shared beneath its broken window, searching for some sign she had missed, some proof that his tenderness had been calculated rather than genuine, and finding, to her own considerable frustration, none at all. Every kindness he had shown her, examined now in the harsh light of his revealed rank, still bore the unmistakable mark of sincerity. It was not his affection she doubted, in the end, but her own judgment, her own dangerous willingness to trust a stranger's kindness after a lifetime of learning that trust, once extended, was so easily turned to advantage. The gossip spread through the village with the particular swiftness such stories always seemed to command, and Eleanor found herself, in the days that followed the revelation, subjected to a fresh and unwelcome scrutiny she had never before experienced. The same neighbors who had scarcely noticed her presence in the 2 years since her parents' deaths now regarded her with open curiosity whenever she walked to the market or sat in her accustomed pew at Sunday services, whispering behind gloved hands about the poor curate's daughter who had somehow captured a grieving duke's private attention, weeks before her own wedding, to another man entirely. She bore the scrutiny with as much dignity as she could summon, though it cost her more than she would ever have admitted, each curious glance a fresh reminder of precisely how publicly her private humiliation had been exposed. It was her cousin, Harriet Marsh, visiting from a neighboring parish for the wedding preparations, who finally gave voice to the question Eleanor had been turning over privately for days. Harriet was some years older than Eleanor, married comfortably to a modest squire, and possessed of the particular bluntness that long settled happiness sometimes granted a woman. "You have not been yourself since Sunday," Harriet observed, finding her cousin sitting idle over an unfinished piece of needlework, her thoughts plainly elsewhere. "The whole village speaks of nothing else. Tell me plainly, Eleanor, did you know, before the vicar's announcement, precisely who your Mr. Cross truly was?" "I did not," Eleanor said. "I knew only that he grieved deeply and listened carefully, and never once made me feel as though my troubles were beneath his notice. I did not know I was confessing my whole heart to a duke, Harriet. I believed myself speaking to an equal." "And does that knowledge change what you felt for him?" Eleanor considered the question longer than she expected to need. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "I know that I feel foolish and exposed, and uncertain whether the tenderness I believed genuine was truly meant for me, or simply happened to fall upon me because I was convenient and near at hand. I know too that despite every reason I have to guard myself more carefully now, I still find myself thinking of him constantly, which frightens me a great deal more than his deception ever did." Harriet studied her cousin with the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had watched Eleanor endure a great many hardships without complaint over the preceding years. "Then perhaps the question is not whether his deception wounded you, it plainly did, and justly so, but whether the wound is severe enough to outweigh whatever genuine feeling grew beneath it. Not every deception is cruelty, Eleanor. Sometimes it is simply fear, wearing a stranger's coat." Her uncle, unaware of the deeper reason for his niece's renewed silence and pallor, pressed forward with the wedding preparations with undiminished urgency, and Eleanor found the days slipping past her with a terrible, inexorable speed. 7 days remaining, then 5, then 3, each one narrowing the world around her until she could scarcely breathe beneath the weight of what approached. Alaric, for his part, endured those same 3 days in a private torment, considerably worsened by his aunt's determined interference. Lady Prudence Sinclair, having heard the same swift gossip that had reached every corner of the parish, arrived at the Abbey within a day of the Sunday revelation, demanding an audience with a directness her nephew had learned, over many years, never to underestimate. "You have made a considerable spectacle of yourself," she said, settling into the chair opposite his study desk with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing crises far larger than a nephew's wounded courtship. The whole county speaks of nothing else. A duke, masquerading as a common scholar, courting a curate's penniless niece, already promised to another man. I confess I do not know whether to be more astonished by your recklessness or your remarkably poor timing. I did not set out to create a spectacle, Aunt, Alaric said. I set out to grieve my brother in peace, and found, instead, a woman whose company eased that grief more thoroughly than anything London's condolences ever managed. And what precisely do you intend to do about it, now that the whole parish knows your name? Lady Prudence's tone softened, very slightly, beneath its habitual briskness. I will not pretend I approve of a match with a family so entirely without fortune or connection, Alaric. I have spent 2 years quietly cultivating introductions to families considerably better suited to secure this dukedom's future. But I have also watched you these past weeks, and I confess I have not seen you carry yourself with such evident vitality since well before your brother's death. Whatever this Miss Vane has done to restore that vitality, I find myself, against my own better judgment, unwilling to stand entirely in its way. Then you will not oppose me, if I choose to pursue her honestly. I did not say I would not oppose you, Lady Prudence said, with the faint, dry humor that was, in its own particular way, as close to affection as she generally permitted herself to show. I said only that I am no longer entirely certain opposition would serve either of us well. Go to her, Alaric, and go plainly, without further disguise or delay. Whatever else this family has lost this past year, I would rather not watch it lose your happiness as well, out of nothing more than wounded pride and poor timing. It was this unexpected blessing, however grudgingly offered, that finally steadied Alaric's resolve. It was on the 3rd night before her wedding that Alaric acted, though not in the manner Eleanor expected. He did not attempt to purchase her freedom outright, understanding, with a clarity born of weeks spent listening to her fierce, careful pride, that such a gesture, however well-intentioned, would only confirm her deepest fear, that she had become, in his eyes, a debt to be settled rather than a woman to be genuinely chosen. Instead, he called upon Edmund Marsh directly, in his true name and rank for the first time since his return to Ashwick, and requested a private audience regarding the estate's records, a pretense that lasted only until the study door had closed behind them. I understand you hold considerable debts, Mr. Marsh, Alaric said, without preamble, and that your niece's marriage to Baron Halstead has been arranged expressly to settle them. Edmund Marsh's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to calculation as he registered, for the first time, precisely whom he was addressing. Your Grace, I confess I did not expect. I am certain you did not, Alaric said. I will speak plainly, as I understand plain speech is a commodity you value highly when it serves your interests. I am prepared to settle the whole of your debts myself, on the sole condition that the arrangement with Baron Halstead be dissolved immediately, and that Miss Vane's future be placed entirely in her own hands, free of any further obligation to your household or your creditors. Marsh's eyes narrowed with the particular shrewdness of a man calculating a considerably more advantageous transaction than the one currently before him. Your Grace's generosity is remarkable, though I confess I do not entirely understand its cause. Might I ask what interest a duke holds in my niece's marital arrangements? You may ask, Alaric said, but I do not owe you an answer beyond this. Miss Vane deserves a future chosen freely, by her own heart, rather than dictated by your ledgers. Whether that future includes myself is a matter I intend to place entirely in her hands, not yours. Do we have an understanding, Mr. Marsh? The debts, once weighed against the considerable inconvenience of losing so advantageous a transaction, proved less important to Edmund Marsh than the fresh advantage now presenting itself, and the agreement was struck within the hour. Baron Halstead informed by careful diplomatic letter that the engagement could not proceed, the whole of Marsh's debts quietly settled by the Duke's solicitor, and Eleanor's future, for the first time in years, placed entirely beyond her uncle's controlling reach. Baron Halstead did not receive the news with any great composure. He arrived at Marsh House the following morning, uninvited and visibly affronted, demanding an explanation from a man he plainly regarded as having broken a settled bargain out of mere caprice. Eleanor, hearing the raised voices from the adjoining room, found herself listening despite every instinct urging her away, and heard, for the first time, precisely how little her own happiness had ever factored into the arrangement at all. "I was promised a wife by month's end," Halstead said, his voice carrying the particular cold fury of a man more wounded in his pride than his affections. "I do not appreciate being made a fool of before the whole county, Marsh, whatever ducal interference has seen fit to intervene in a private contract." "The Duke's involvement leaves me little room to maneuver," Marsh said, with the careful, placating tone he reserved for creditors and other men whose goodwill he could not afford to lose. "I assure you, Baron, the arrangement's dissolution reflects no dissatisfaction on my part, only circumstances entirely beyond my control." "Circumstances," Halstead repeated, with evident contempt. "Tell your niece, Marsh, that she has traded a settled, comfortable future for a duke's passing fancy, and that fancies of that sort rarely outlast the season that produced them. She will find herself considerably less fortunate than she imagines once his interest wanes." The words, overheard through the thin wall, struck Eleanor with more force than she expected, not because she believed them true, but because they gave voice to the same fear she had been fighting privately for days, the fear that whatever Alaric felt for her might prove, in the end, no more durable than the season's fashion, a duke's momentary indulgence rather than a lasting devotion. She carried that fear with her through the remainder of the day, and it was still sitting heavy in her chest that evening when she learned, from her uncle's brisk announcement, that her engagement to Halstead had been formally dissolved. She learned of it not from Alaric himself, but from her uncle, who informed her of the dissolved engagement with a briskness that suggested the matter had already ceased to interest him beyond its immediate resolution. "The Duke of Ashwick has settled my debts and ended your arrangement with Halstead," he said, barely glancing up from his correspondence. "I do not fully understand his reasons, nor do I particularly care to. You are free of the marriage, Eleanor. What you do with that freedom is now entirely your own concern." Eleanor stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the whole weight of years of dread lifting so suddenly from her shoulders that she felt almost dizzy with the release of it, and beneath the relief, a fierce, complicated tangle of gratitude and hurt pride that she could not immediately untangle. She had been rescued, precisely as she had feared she might be, by a man whose wealth and title had made her freedom possible in a manner her own efforts never could have achieved. And yet the rescue itself, offered without any demand for gratitude, without any condition attached beyond her own future happiness, did not feel like the transactional gesture she had accused him of intending. It felt, when she finally allowed herself to examine it honestly, like the truest proof of love she had ever been offered. Before she sought him out, however, she turned first to her uncle, drawing herself up with a composure that surprised them both. "I will not thank you for this, uncle," she said. "You did not free me from Halstead out of any concern for my happiness. You freed me because a duke's arithmetic proved more favorable than a baron's. I have lived 2 years beneath your roof, feeling as though my worth began and ended with whatever advantage I might secure you, and I will not pretend, now that fortune has finally favored me, that the wound of those 2 years is simply erased. I am grateful for my freedom. I am not grateful to you for granting it, when you never once considered granting it for my own sake." Edmund Marsh had no ready answer for his niece's plain, unflinching honesty, and for perhaps the first time in their long acquaintance, he did not attempt to offer one, only nodding once, stiffly, before returning to his correspondence. And Eleanor left the room with her dignity intact, feeling lighter for having spoken the truth aloud at last, whatever it cost her in her uncle's continued goodwill. She found Alaric that evening, not in the ruined chapel, but in the small chapel garden beyond it, where a scattering of late autumn roses still clung stubbornly to their thorned branches, and he turned at the sound of her approach with an expression so carefully guarded, so plainly braced for further rejection, that something in Eleanor's chest ached with sudden, overwhelming tenderness. "You settled my uncle's debts," she said, "and asked nothing in return." "I asked for nothing because I wanted nothing from you that was not offered freely," Alaric said. "I have spent enough of my life watching people calculate what my title might purchase them. I did not wish to become, in your eyes, merely another transaction, a rescue you felt obligated to repay with gratitude you did not truly feel." "And if I told you," Eleanor said, moving closer with a courage that surprised even herself, "that the gratitude I feel is only the smallest part of what I carry for you tonight? That beneath it lies something considerably larger and considerably more frightening, because it asks me to trust again after a lifetime of learning that trust is rarely rewarded." "Then I would tell you," he said, his voice unsteady now with a hope he could no longer entirely contain, "that I have loved you since the very first night I heard you pray in that broken chapel, asking for nothing more than the courage to endure what you believed inescapable. I did not fall in love with a duchess's fortune, Eleanor, nor with the convenient solution your rescue might represent to my aunt's persistent matchmaking. I fell in love with a woman who knelt on cold stone and prayed for courage rather than rescue, and taught me, in the process, that grief shared honestly is a far lighter burden than grief carried alone." Eleanor closed the remaining distance between them, and when he drew her gently into his arms beneath the last of the autumn roses, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm beneath her ribs, that whatever wound his concealment had caused, it had not been born of cruelty, but of a wounded man's desperate hope to be loved for something other than his rank, a hope she recognized, in her own heart, as the very same fear that had made her guard her own trust so carefully for so many years. "I do not forgive easily," she said softly, echoing words she had once thought she would never say to him again. "But I find, standing here, that I am willing to try." "Then I will spend whatever time it takes," he said, "proving myself worthy of that trial, for as long as you will permit me the chance, without disguise, without concealment, and without a single further secret standing unspoken between us." He kept his word in the weeks that followed, calling upon her openly now, without disguise or false name, courting her with a patient devotion that steadily, gently dissolved whatever lingering wariness remained between them. He introduced her to his aunt, Lady Prudence, who received the news of her nephew's attachment with considerably more grace and warmth than either of them expected, admitting privately that she had grown weary of arranging matches born of calculation rather than genuine affection, and that whatever had transformed her grieving nephew's countenance these past weeks was plainly worth considerably more than any fortune she might otherwise have secured for him. It was Lady Prudence, in fact, who suggested the wedding take place in the very chapel where the whole tangled truth had first taken root, a suggestion Eleanor accepted with a joy that surprised her, understanding instinctively that no grander cathedral could ever hold the particular significance of that broken, moonlit sanctuary where a duke had once knelt behind her in secret grief and found, in her whispered prayer, the first genuine comfort he had known since his brother's death. The restoration of the chapel took the better part of the winter, funded quietly by Alaric and overseen, at Eleanor's particular request, with careful attention to preserving its old, weathered character rather than transforming it into something grander than its history deserved. The broken tracery of the east window was repaired, but not replaced, the ancient stone left to bear the marks of its long neglect, because Eleanor understood, better than anyone, that some scars were worth keeping visible as reminders of what had been overcome rather than erased entirely. The engagement itself, announced formally within a fortnight of Halstead's dismissal, drew considerably more county attention than either of them found entirely comfortable, though Alaric bore the renewed scrutiny with a patience Eleanor had not expected from a man who had spent the whole of the autumn hiding from precisely this sort of notice. He escorted her openly to church each Sunday, called upon her at Marsh House with a regularity that left no room for further gossip about the nature of his intentions, and made a particular point, at every social gathering the engagement required them to attend, of introducing her, not as a curiosity or a rescued unfortunate, but simply and plainly as the woman he intended to marry, with a pride that silenced, within a matter of weeks, most of the whispered speculation that had followed the Sunday revelation. There remained, even so, a handful of guests at the small gathering following their formal betrothal announcement who could not entirely disguise their surprise at the match, and it was there, at a modest dinner hosted by Lady Prudence, to formally welcome Eleanor into the family's acquaintance, that Eleanor found herself seated beside a distant cousin of Alaric's, who seemed determined to remind her, through a series of pointed questions about her family's circumstances, precisely how far beneath the Duke's usual consideration she truly stood. "It is remarkable," the cousin observed, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "how quickly some families rise, when fortune favors them so unexpectedly. I confess I had never heard the name Vane before this autumn." "You would not have," Eleanor said, meeting the woman's gaze without flinching. "My father was a country curate, and a good one, who taught me that a person's worth is measured by their conduct rather than their fortune. I do not apologize for my circumstances, madam, nor for the affection His Grace has chosen to offer me despite them. I would ask only that you extend me the same courtesy you would offer any other guest at this table, whatever your private opinion of my suitability." The quiet steadiness of the response, delivered without anger or apology, drew Alaric's attention from across the table, and the look he gave her then, equal parts pride and tenderness, told Eleanor, more plainly than any further declaration could have, precisely how deeply he had come to admire the very dignity that had first drawn him to kneel behind her in the ruined chapel months before. They were married there the following spring, beneath the very window through which moonlight had first fallen upon a stranger rising from the shadows, and Eleanor's uncle, invited more out of obligation than genuine affection, watched the ceremony with an expression that suggested he had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of what his own careless arithmetic had so nearly cost him. Baron Halstead, informed of the marriage through the county's efficient gossip network, was heard to remark only that he had always found Miss Vane rather too solemn for his taste, a judgment that Eleanor, hearing it second-hand, found herself entirely unable to mourn. When the vows had been spoken and the small gathering of tenants and household staff had scattered among the chapel's restored garden to celebrate, Alaric drew his new duchess aside, to the very spot where he had first risen from the shadows behind her, and pressed into her hands a small, worn prayer book that had belonged, he explained, to his mother, its pages marked in her careful hand, with passages she had turned to most often in her own grief. "I kept it beside me through every year of mourning I have carried since my brother's death," he said, "because I did not know, until I heard you pray in this very chapel, that grief could be shared rather than simply endured alone. I want you to have it now, not because I no longer need its comfort, but because I have found, in loving you, a comfort considerably greater than any prayer I ever whispered alone in the dark, in all those long, solitary months before I ever knew to hope for someone kneeling quietly beside me." "You foolish, wonderful man," Eleanor said, her voice thick with tears that carried nothing now but joy. "You might simply have introduced yourself honestly from the very first evening, and spared us both so many nights of needless sorrow." "I might have," he agreed, drawing her close beneath the chapel's restored window, where the spring sunlight fell now in warm, unbroken gold, rather than the pale, fractured moonlight of that first uncertain autumn night. "But then I would never have learned what it felt like to kneel behind a woman in the dark and hear her pray not for rescue, but for courage, and I find, Eleanor, having finally known that particular grace, that I would not trade the lesson for anything this world could offer me twice over." In the years that followed, the story told among the tenants and villagers of Ashwick shifted gradually from a tale of a grieving duke who had once vanished from society under a stranger's name into something warmer and more enduring, the story of a young woman who had knelt in a ruined chapel asking only for the strength to endure her own hardship, and found, kneeling unknowingly behind her, a duke whose own grief had taught him, at last, how to truly listen. Mothers told it to their daughters as a lesson in the quiet power of an honest prayer, and to their sons as a reminder that the truest courtship asks not for a woman's gratitude, but for the chance to earn her trust honestly, without disguise or condition. Lady Prudence, for her part, never fully admitted that her nephew's unconventional match had proven wiser than any arrangement her own careful diplomacy might have secured, though her manner toward the new Duchess warmed, year by year, into something that resembled genuine affection rather than mere tolerance. She took a particular pride, never openly confessed, in watching Eleanor manage the estate's charitable concerns with a diligence and compassion that considerably exceeded anything the family's previous duchesses had troubled themselves to offer, and she was heard, on more than one occasion, informing her own acquaintances that the Duke of Ashwick had made, in the end, the soundest match of his generation. Harriet Marsh, whose blunt wisdom had first nudged Eleanor toward reconsidering Alaric's deception, remained a frequent and welcome guest at Ashwick in the years that followed, and it was to her, more than to any other member of the family, that Eleanor confided the small, private details of her growing happiness that seemed too delicate to share with anyone less familiar with the whole difficult journey that had preceded it. And on quiet evenings, when the chapel bell rang softly across the abbey grounds and the light fell warm through the restored east window, one could still find the Duke and Duchess of Ashwick kneeling together at the same broken altar rail where it had all begun, no longer strangers seeking separate solitudes, nor a duke and a desperate bride divided by concealment and fear, but simply two people who had learned, in the most unexpected of chapels, that the truest love begins not with a grand declaration, but with the quiet courage to kneel beside someone else's sorrow and stay. Eleanor kept her nightly habit of prayer even after the wedding, though she no longer knelt alone in the cold and no longer prayed for mere endurance. She prayed now with gratitude and with a peace she had never once believed herself entitled to during those long, uncertain months of her uncle's careful arithmetic, and Alaric knelt beside her every evening without fail, no longer hidden in the shadows of a broken pillar, but present openly, honestly, and entirely by her side, exactly where, she had come to understand, he had always truly belonged. Their daughter, born some years later, was christened in that same restored chapel, and Eleanor liked to tell her, on quiet evenings when the girl grew old enough to understand the story properly, that the greatest gifts in life rarely announced themselves with fanfare or title, but arrived instead in the quiet, unremarkable hours when one least expected to be truly seen, kneeling in an old ruin, whispering a prayer meant for no one's ears but heaven's, and finding, all along, that heaven had sent someone to kneel quietly behind her, listening, long before she ever knew to hope for it, or dared to believe such quiet grace was still possible for a woman in her circumstances. "Did you know at once that you loved him, Mamma?" the girl would ask, every time, though she had heard the answer a dozen times before, curled beside her mother on the same worn cushion, watching the candlelight flicker across the old chapel walls. "I knew," Eleanor would say, "the very moment I discovered he had been kneeling behind me all along, not to intrude upon my sorrow, but simply to share it. That is how you will know it too, my darling, whenever love finds you, not by the grandness of the gesture, but by the quiet, patient willingness of someone to kneel beside you in your hardest hour, and ask for nothing in return but the chance to stay." And Alaric, listening from the doorway as he so often did, would think, as he thought every single time, that he had never in his life been more grateful for a broken chapel window, a stray moonlit evening, and the particular courage of a woman who had once prayed only for strength, and found, instead, an entire lifetime of love waiting quietly behind her in the dark.